down with Andy Marcell, CEO of Reinsurance Solutions at Aon, to discuss risk mitigation, climate change, and the sophisticated data modeling going on in the industry today. Of course, Aon is our headline partner at Future Human this year. So I also have to ask Andy, what was it that made them support this year's program in Dublin? Andy Marcell, it's fantastic to have you with us today. I suppose I want to start really, there's probably never been a more volatile time for the current business leader and the professional as we're coming out of a global pandemic and we're seeing spiraling fuel costs and supply chain disruption. How can the insurance industry be an ally as organizations are trying to address these risks and can they even transform them into opportunities in your view?
Well, I think, in terms of being an ally, right, the core principle of being an ally is to bring understanding to risk and be able to measure it to the extent that the insurance industry can measure the severity and frequency of potential, events, whether they be supply chain disruption, climate change, broad economic impact is not something that is, really solvable by the insurance industry. But, some of the things that are magnifying that, so the pandemic, the systemic risk in the tail, whether it's a supply chain disruption, whether it's weather events, those are things that the insurance industry can assist large corporates and other parts of the economy solve for by transferring risk. The law of large numbers, if many want to solve that problem simultaneously, you bring, stability to a potential set of answers. So that's a place that the insurance industry can help, but it's not easy. You need to invest in technology and solutions, and Aon in particular is looking to solve those by its investments and its articulation of those issues with the insurance companies on behalf of our clients.
And in that context, we have to talk about climate risks. How big an issue is that for Aon and its clients?
It's front and center right now because apart from the social impact, right, which I don't want to minimize, right? That's often written about. It's a political issue, it's a real issue, it's a popular issue, and there's lots of entities around the world trying to figure out how to reduce energy consumption, go to clean energy, and there's a huge dynamic friction between those desires and poverty in the third world. And I don't think that there's an easy answer, but there is a willingness by corporations like Aon and governments to solve that problem. But for the insurance industry, the way that it's manifested itself primarily has been, if you look back at the last 5 years, of loss activity, not just the potential frequency and severity of wind events in the US and say Japan earlier, but also what we call in our industry secondary perils, like flood. There seems to be more of them associated with wind events. You think recently in Germany, and then some of the sort of hurricanes like Ida that came onshore seem to last longer, penetrate inland more with greater sort of rain events and sort of calamitous flooding in the northeast, which is unusual. But also you see you saw the same thing in Australia in the last few months, but also wildfire. Right? So wildfire in California, wildfire in Australia, wildfire in Portugal, drier, conditions lasting longer, not just set alight by human, man-made events being like sort of transmission outages, but also by lightning, by more severe weather patterns. And those things for insurance companies are actually very difficult to model relative to the way that they were looking to sort of parameterize and evaluate those risks in the past. That potentially has fundamentally changed. So the reason I say potentially is because in all sort of recorded weather events, you'll always find periods where there's been severe losses. And so the question is the last 5 or 7 years indicative of what's going to happen in the next 5 or 7 years? And there's no real answer to that, except that it's probably the high degree of probability that the frequency of sort of hurricanes in the US has gone up. I think historically people looked at sort of 10, 15 years ago, 1.5 landfalls a year. Now most reinsurers and insurers sort of look at risk as sort of 2.5 landfalls a year, right? But then there's the severity. And so the actual cost of those events has risen. And it's risen because, there's more buildings, more people, but also they seem to, because they're wetter, there seem to be more, loss associated with them as a consequence. And what is the quantum of that loss and how long lasting it is? And that actually impacts how much capital the insurers are willing to put against those risks, and how analysts, if they're public companies, sort of view that risk, because analysts, typically investors, don't like volatility, and reinsurers are solving for volatility. So the extent that that volatility is more difficult to measure, then investors get less comfortable with that risk. So in that sense, today what we've seen is that rates have started to rise, not just because of losses that people have paid out, but because people are less willing to put capital to work against the risk when they're not entirely sure what the outcome is.
And I mean, tell me more about those climate risks and challenges and the work Aon is doing to assess them and to help organizations protect themselves, I suppose, from that risk and benefit from opportunities.
So we have a pretty large business on the reinsurance side, which protects people, insurance companies, against what we call property catastrophe. So we've been placing those programs. We've been trying to help people evaluate the quantum of that risk. So we sort of partner with the third-party model vendors that are in the industry today that look at those risks, but we also invest in creating our own models. So we spend a fair amount of money in getting our own wind models, for example, in the US, approved by the state of Florida. We're partnering with Texas and looking at their sort of wind risk. And in order to, as we sort of change our models, we've partnered also with third-party educational institutions like Columbia University, who are looking at the impact of climate change and doing a study for us so that we can bring what we call an Aon view of risk to our clients to help them assess, what the potential frequency and severity of these events is and what they can therefore do to mitigate the impacts on them, and also get the adequate rates for assuming that risk, which is something that needs to be transferred, from the economy to risk takers who can share that around the world and get a return for it. So that's where we're focused. And additionally, we think about how do we, look at that risk globally, because when you're looking at, say, isolating a risk in just the US, right, you're not getting, the impacts of having no loss activity in a given year in say continental Europe or Japan. So the extent that we can start packaging, risks around the world and presenting those to reinsurers as a portfolio. So we have, a thing called Marilla right now, which is how we sort of package our property cat risk to certain reinsurers. And there's sort of almost like an index result rather than an individual regional result. And that seems to be more stable. And we're talking to a lot of investors about how to think about that risk, to draw that capital back into the market to stabilize, the future for our clients and ultimately for the insureds around the world.
Okay, fascinating. And I mean, it's funny, I think people don't think about insurers and modeling to that extent. I mean, how important the data and the research and the modeling is now. So that's rather fascinating. Tell me a little bit about your decision to work with us at Future Human, and thanks a million. We're thrilled to have Aon on board. But I just want to hear from yourself a little bit about what made you decide to come on board and partner with Future Human this year, and why it was important to you.
Well, I think that the most important thing about the Future Human is to speak to what you just stated, which is how do you embrace the intellectual inquisitiveness of humans, right? the desire of entities to understand risk and modeling mass amounts of data and bring innovation to how you think about data, and employing all the sort of technological advancements that are evident in the world today, whether that's artificial intelligence to look at bringing more sophisticated predictive modeling. And actually, if you embrace innovation, which is what Future Human's all about, if you understand that the future employee, right, is going to need to understand and embrace technology, not only just around how you understand risk, but how that risk is even distributed, digitally, and the data capture in that, becomes essential in creating solutions. that will solve, some of the really big questions that are out there, like supply chain. If you think of supply chain, it's an immensely complicated, interrelated set of, circumstances that may not seem as interrelated as they first appear. But you can follow technology around network theory, which speaks to the interrelating of industries together, and if there's a particular event, how that impacts many industries at the same time, and trying to quantify that and bring stability to that distribution chain is important. And also, thinking through how you can bring certain professional standards to the distribution chain. Right? So, I mean, examples of that might be as simple as, it's a complicated issue, but so I say that with sort of tongue in cheek, food distribution. Mm-hmm. Like food distribution, if you think of some of the restaurants that nearly went out of business because of contamination, they're getting their food supply, all the way down the chain, and some along that chain that they had no control over, they just picked, partners, there was some form of contamination. So how do you bring insurance discipline, to ensuring that there's certain policy protection to those providers, and that those providers are held to a common standard to, ensure the future safety of food distribution, to restaurants in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And so when you start thinking, it's an enormous, right, it's a fascinating task, but it's an enormous task that the insurance industry is taking on. And so Future Human, to make people see the possibilities and embrace technology and innovation, and to have a sort of an employee of the future that can understand that, is critical if we're going to solve any of these problems. We can't just, show up to the same office every day, sort of do the same thing that we used to do and expect to solve, a series of increasing complex issues that are, and that complexity is increasingly almost like Moore's law. It's like it's dynamically increasing and multiplying all the time.
Yeah, well, we think it's very forward-thinking of you, and we're delighted to have you with us for Future Human. And it was fantastic talking to you today. So thanks a million, Andy Marcell. Really most enjoyable to meet you.
You're welcome, Anne. It's nice to meet you too, and speak to you again.
Definitely.